Hello, everybody. Welcome to another podcast. Today's is called Bringing Bitcoin Mining to Britain. And I'm delighted to have Jason Deane from Renewablox on the call today. How you doing, Jason?
I'm very well, thank you, Carl. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I've given people a teaser for what we're going to be talking about. I think we'll probably best start with how you got involved with bringing Bitcoin mining to Britain and a bit about your background to let people know who you are.
Okay, right. I always wonder how far back to go, but let's not go too crazy. So very traditional sort of, conventional upbringing, I suppose, and education. I went to university. My degree was primarily in law, and then moved on to various, large companies, cable and wireless, Microsoft. Left to start my own business and did a few of those actually over the years, but mostly quite small. And one of them included actually the UK's first chain of internet cafes and game zones, which was a fun thing to
What
do
was that one
at the
called?
time.
What was that one called?
It was called Quarks originally, and then as I sold some of them off, one of them actually bought the name as well, so I had to change the name of the remaining ones to Quantum.
Okay.
Um, but they're all gone now, of course, because that time has passed.
Yeah, I remember it well. Go on.
Yeah, it was great fun. But I first discovered Bitcoin in 2013, so really quite early, but did what all Bitcoiners do, which is ignore it because it's obviously a scam. Um, and so that cost me 3 years because I kept coming back to it and started thinking maybe this isn't a scam. And then it was investigated it properly. Then the penny dropped, and as it's been with so many other things, all in straight away. So that's it. Once I got it, that's all I wanted to do. 2017, I started mining. Just built a hobby miner at home. We actually had one cafe left, and we actually used the downtime to mine. And then built a bigger rig. Then moved to ASICs in about 2018, and then got involved with lots of different projects in different parts of the world and have been mining ever since. But of course, there's no mining in the UK, and I'm sure we're going to touch on that at some point today.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I mean, yeah, we men of a certain age, and it's always interesting when you get those people who didn't go through internet cafes and the internet and all those kind of innovations. But obviously, Bitcoin's another wave of I'm going to use the word infrastructure because I have a background in thinking about infrastructures. I know we've thought in the past about how Bitcoin mining is obviously at some level an infrastructure technology, really. Do you want to just, before we go into, how it could impact on the UK's infrastructure, because I know, I'm aware that Renewablox has some big problems it could potentially solve on a national level. Do you want to just explain a little bit about Bitcoin mining for those who are not so familiar? I think a lot of people on the call will probably be familiar to a certain extent, and maybe as you take people on that journey of what Bitcoin mining is, maybe start to open up, how it could impact, the UK and the infrastructure here.
Sure. Well, it's probably is a good place to start because it takes quite a bit of time to really understand Bitcoin, and there's all these levels below that, and one of those levels is mining. And the easiest way to think about this is this. So if I send you Bitcoin or vice versa, there is no central authority. Okay, so there's no bank, there's no CEO, there's no department that you can call to manage or stop this. As we know, the whole point is this peer-to-peer system. So something must happen behind the scenes to enable that Bitcoin to get from you to me or vice versa. And I'm slightly simplifying, but fundamentally that process is managed by these mysterious miners you hear about behind the scenes. And all the miners are really doing is a couple of things. Apart from securing the network, which is a very important part of this, they're also managing those transactions. So they're grouping them together. This is all managed automatically in the background through the protocol itself. And through a process of encryption, they're effectively kind of validating those transactions or proving those transactions. And this happens every 10 minutes. It's a repeated cycle, or an average of 10 minutes, I should say. So that's basically how it works. And there is a huge layer of complexity behind this, but we don't really need to go into that. The point for today is that the way to imagine a Bitcoin mining operation is lots and lots of computers. So you think about a server rack, for example. If you've never seen a Bitcoin operation or Bitcoin farm, just think of a server rack. So a rack of machines, but they only have one job. And that one job is to try and validate the next block. And they do that really just by guessing a hash to unlock that block effectively. And of course, the more times you can make the guess for that block, the more power you have, the more chance you have of winning that block. And of course, you want to win the block because all the little transaction fees that are being collected to pay the miners are in that block. So you get that reward, but you also get the next block reward. So you're effectively rewarded in Bitcoin for doing these activities. So that's fundamentally how it works. But the key part of this is you have to pay for the power and the equipment for that to operate. So it's specialist equipment, so you need to acquire that. But also, these are quite power-hungry pieces of kit. So and they're quite loud and they're quite hot as well. That's another aspect of this. So I always say to people, imagine a hairdryer on full power with the boost button on, and that's the kind of noise and heat that you would get from any kind of fan-cooled operation. There are quieter versions, but that's kind of the easiest way to imagine it. So these machines all linked together. It's an open network. Anyone can join or leave at any time. There's no restrictions on how much time you're up or running or how much you contribute to the network. Your rewards are commensurate with the effort you put in. And this is where the expression proof of work comes from. You know, no one gets Bitcoin for free, right? You either mine it, earn it, or pay for it. It's just one of the ways of acquiring Bitcoin. But there is also a cost of that, and that's this. Your proof of your costs is your proof of work, effectively. Does that give you a good enough background?
Yeah, yeah. So that starts off with, what Bitcoin mining is. We've talked in the past about the energy in the UK and the grid, and how does that infrastructure potentially get affected by the Bitcoin mining process? This kind of a mental jump that people need to go through there, take them through it.
Yeah, so it goes back to this whole thing about power, right? So miners are always looking for power, and of course, the business model, if you like, just looking at it from a purely kind of commercial angle, is that the cheaper you can have your power, the more hash power you can send to the network or can afford to send to the network, and therefore the more rewards you can get. And of course, the holy grail is completely free power, right? So there is this competition for power. That's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is that there is an absolutely enormous amount of wasted energy in the UK for various different reasons, and we can touch on some of those reasons if you like. So there is an obvious correlation between these two things. So if we have an industry that needs a lot of power very cheaply, and we have an industry that is overproducing in many cases power, or can't transmit that power, or that power is stranded and it's actually wasted, either earthed or burned off, then clearly it makes sense to link those two things together. And the numbers are staggering. So, we work out it's about 3.4 million households a year of power is wasted in the UK every year. And it runs now into billions of pounds. And you and I pay for that, by the way, on our bills. That's part of what we contribute to is these systems, subsidy schemes, waste systems that all exist because of the inefficiency in the powers in our national power system.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I know obviously we're well aware, and a lot of people out there are aware that Bitcoin has been positioned as, this part you mentioned earlier about being very energy intensive and therefore bad for the environment and bad for the infrastructure, because you need the infrastructure. Of course, now that dialogue is maybe calming down a little bit because everybody realizes or wants to have AI everywhere, and therefore they want data centers for AI, but suddenly it's bad for mining Bitcoin. But But yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you for some stats, and obviously you've given me some stats there in terms of the actual scale of the waste and the scale of the inefficiency. So I think, when we're thinking about infrastructures, just talk to me a little bit more about, I mean, I think a lot of what both of us are doing, and actually a lot of people that I connect to, is thinking about the UK. We're both Brits. We've been here for a long time. There's this whole debate at the moment about, what's happening to the UK and how can we be a bit more self-sustaining and a bit more efficient potentially. So just talk a little bit more about, I know we touched a bit, maybe expand a bit on this infrastructure. How might it actually work in practice? Because we've got, at the moment, you've talked about Bitcoin mining and, we've got the hair dryers and maybe give a bit more of a scale of the actual, volume of kit that's needed. How feasible is that? How would it actually be geographically located? How does that work alongside the existing power grids?
Okay, I think that's probably best answered with a couple of examples, kind of very small scale example, then a very large, infrastructure level example. So great thing about Bitcoin mining is it's totally modular, right? And you can put it anywhere, so location agnostic. You can't do any of this, of course, with a data center. There's very specific requirements for that, but Bitcoin has that flexibility to be able to operate in that way. So that means you can go down to really quite small levels and kind of hoover up these little pockets of wasted energy. So we do have some projects which are as small as 40 kilowatts. Now that's tiny. No Bitcoin miner, you think of the big players, Riot, Marathon, all these guys, they'd never touch anything like that. It's just, they wouldn't even think about thinking about it. It's so small. But we happen to know where a lot of these little pockets exist. So what will happen is, typical example, this is a fairly common story. We will go to an independent operator who has some kind of generation on site. Now, typically, the most common one of these is an anaerobic digestion site. You've seen those at the giant domes, which, you put all sorts of stuff in, produces methane. That comes out the other end, goes into what's called a CHP, which is basically a generator, and it uses that to generate power, which is great. But the problem is you can't export all of that power in many cases because of these grid constraints. Okay, so you think, so what I do is I'll just turn the CHP down a bit, but this is where it gets interesting, because there is an incentive system in the UK for these generators. There are several actually, but the one that's probably most relevant here is something which actually most people will have heard of in some form or another. It's called a feed-in tariff. Now for generators, it's a little bit different because they get paid actually quite well to produce the power, and that's metered at production. But there's also another part of that, which is the export, which most of us are familiar with. So if you've got solar on your roof, you've probably got what's called an SEG, Smart Export Guarantee. So you'll be paid, 7 or 8 pence for your power that you contribute to the grid. So you have that, they have that as well, but they also have something like, and it could be anywhere from 15 to 20p a kilowatt to actually produce the power. So if you think about it, that's a very good incentive just to keep producing anyway, even though you can't export it all. But if you've got a difference of, say, 100 kilowatts, which is a fairly common number, what do you do with that 100 kilowatts? Now, it may surprise you to know that in many cases, these operators will run a cable out of the back of their CHP, literally to a big industrial heater, and they'll heat the air or an empty building just to get rid of the power. So you can't blame the operators. I know people get angry about this sometimes. I mean, if you create an incentive system like that, that's the result you will get, right? Because you can't, it's not their fault they can't export because of the grid limitations. So we'll go in and we'll say to the operator, right, tell you what, take the cable out that heater, put it in the back of our miners. We'll pay for the miners. You give us the power for free. Then there'll be a period where we'll get our capex back because we'll just keep the revenues. It doesn't cost you anything anyway, and you're still getting a feed-in tariff. And at the end of that period, we'll literally split the revenues with you, so we can monetize that energy and contribute to the network. So it's a very small kind of level. It's very easy to place these units. Then you've got right at the other end of the scale, and this is all the stuff you read about in the news most of the time. These are the big wind farms, big operations, gigawatts of power. And we've kind of, we've invested, we've created incentive schemes to build these operations, which is great. What we haven't done is build the infrastructure to move that power where it needs to go. And this problem is particularly acute in Scotland, because that's where most of the wind farms are. But in reality, there's not really any way to connect that power and send it to over the border, really what's called the B6 border in electrical terms, and send that south. So it gets stuck in a thermal constraint. Thermal, because if you try and send it, it will melt the lines, right? So they've got to do something with this power. So what we do is we pay the wind turbines to turn off, point it into the wind so that they don't turn properly. That's called a curtailment cost. Now, the second part of this, of course, because we actually haven't then got the power we need because it's not being transmitted from the wind farm. So instead, what we do is we power up these big gas peaker plants, and these exist all around the UK, and they're great big pieces of equipment that sit there on standby. And when power is needed, they power up, use huge amounts of gas to produce the energy that's missing from the wind farm. So now we've got to pay for that as well. And that's why you end up with this big imbalance. Now, sorry, it's a slightly long-winded answer, but I'm getting to the point now. What NESO, that's our energy operator, decided to do, they've looked at this and said, right, these costs are going up to like 6, 7, 8 billion in the next year. It's too big. We can't cope with this. What about if we let the wind farms produce the power anyway and try and find a way to use it locally in Scotland? Okay, and they created a new market called demand for constraints. And there's megawatts of power available here. And basically what's going to happen is they're going to allow new operators with flexible operations, such as Bitcoin mining, to come in and place their assets on various different points on the node and just absorb that power when it comes in. And that power will be given away, not for free, but extremely advantageous terms. And that still works out a lot cheaper than paying the curtailment on the wind farms. So you've got a very small operation, and then you've got something which could scale up to multiple megawatts and be placed anywhere on the network.
Yeah, and I'm just aware, obviously, I've been looking to Bitcoin mining for years, and there's all these other examples as well, aren't there, in Africa, where you've got a village that doesn't have electricity, and all of a sudden you're able, to talk to your point about the smaller scale, you're able to actually give people electricity that don't have the opportunity because of the modular aspects that you mentioned, and the flexibility of all this. And I think it's great that you gave sort of proper detail there so people can kind of get a sense of what you're actually talking about. I'm just very curious. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but I'm always a fan of, giving someone who's a founder of a startup like this the opportunity to really talk big. Because you mentioned how this can be, small or big. Let's just talk about the big for a moment. Like, if you were able to, find a way to actually get this adopted more, and obviously that's part of the challenge of just getting these people on board and on side and educated, which is obviously what we're partly doing today. Um, what is the sort of impact that you think? Paint me a picture of where you think this could go, and almost like give me a sense of what, if we're talking about the national infrastructure, how could that look? What would you
Yeah,
like?
it's big. Is the answer. I mean, obviously, the scale is such that I think even if we were to receive, hundreds of millions of pounds, we probably, I'm talking about in funding here, we still probably couldn't even make a dent in the size of the actual power that's available up there. It is vast, and it's going to be at least a decade until these infrastructure solutions are found. I mean, they are building them right now, but it's very hard to build this stuff. So we think the impact's really major. We think we could build it big enough that we could have an impact on consumer bills. That depends how fast we can scale. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to do our absolute best to try and do that on the national level, but also hoover up all of these little bits of wasted energy, and get some of these assets, because there are actually assets which are stranded completely off the grid. They were built, millions of pounds were spent, and they can't get grid connection for at least 10 years. We've got a couple of projects like that. And some of these are owned by pension funds, and they're just losing money on the asset because of this issue with this backlog with grid constraints. But we can come in and set up Bitcoin mining, and that immediately solves that problem for them. So there's impact very much on for the local producer. There's very much for even larger operations like these pension fund owned hydro plants, for example. And then you've got the grid impact as well. And the beautiful thing about all of this is that it is a real win-win for all parties. Just one final point, actually, if I may, I'll just jump in here, because the one part of this that no one really ever thinks about is the fact, if you look at the map, we can see where hash rate is coming from around the world. And so you can always see, which countries moving up, moving down. Years ago it was China. Now it's very much the US, and it does, change from time to time. But if you look at the UK, it's basically nothing. I mean, there's a tiny number, but we suspect some of that's VPN activity. From my point of view, I'm thinking there's a national security issue here. I'm thinking longer term, but as Bitcoin grows and it's more adopted, I mean, we're very behind in the UK, but we know that other countries are moving forward with this very, very quickly, even on a sovereign level. I mean, you think of El Salvador, Kingdom of Bhutan, Paraguay, all these kind of places, they're doing this already. At some point, we're going to realize that we need to do the same. And we don't have any hash rate coming from the UK currently. And in the coming hash rate wars, which I think was a phrase coined by Max Kaiser originally, we need to play a part. So there is part of me which does consider that as well.
Just go into, just for those people who might hear the phrase hash rate wars, just round that out a little bit more for people to understand, because obviously I know what you're talking about, but just because I think some of these people like yourselves are pioneering, and you can almost see where things are going, like you just described. But some people out there might not have gone through that thought process. So just spell out a bit, because I think also when I think about it, I often talk to people about Bitcoin and where it might be going, and sometimes you can have so many touch points and milestones of things that now used to be talked about, but then happened. And so, I think this is another one where, as you say, Max has been talking about this stuff for many, many a year. And then we have seen an increase, as always, with the hash rate's been going up, but it's been, a different kind of global setup. Just talk a bit more about all of that. I mean, Bhutan also was interesting, wasn't it? And how they just started generating quite a lot of income through the mining process.
Yeah, I mean, they're a great example, actually. But look, the idea of hash rate wars, it's all about resource, right? Everything's always about resource. Arguments, wars. Look what's going on in Iran right now. I mean, fundamentally, it's about various different things, but really it's about oil. So oil has always been, the resource that everyone's been after. It's what your production levels are, what you control, how you feed the world market, so on and so forth. Now, translate that into a kind of digital sense. If the world does move towards anything resembling a Bitcoin standard, that network security is important. So if you are a country which is entirely dependent on other countries for that hash rate, that's not necessarily a bad thing on its own, but it does make you dependent on those countries for that hash rate. I understand it doesn't work in quite exactly the same way as other commodities, but it is a consideration. There are potential risks involved with this. So you want to make sure you're at least in the game to some degree, so that you've got some hash rate and actually using that mining as well in the beneficial ways that other countries like Bhutan and that we've mentioned use. And by the way, they all do it in different ways. So Bhutan is hydro, whereas El Salvador's geothermal. And I've actually been to that operation in Berlin. It's very, very cool to walk around there and feel the rumble of the volcano under you while you're seeing these miners hashing away. But it's a genius bit of work, and it's a natural use of their resources. In a way, our natural resource is wasted energy because we're producing it and paying for it anyway. So we should use that to secure our position on the global hash rate map.
I've got two thoughts. Let's see if we can come to one of them later. Just because I was conscious that, you know what it's like when you talk about Bitcoin, sometimes all of a sudden a phrase is made where you think actually some people might have a little bit of an issue with that being assumed. But you mentioned the thing about if we're in a world where there's a Bitcoin standard. Now, obviously, we might have a certain lens from having done certain research about, there are people who talk in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
Just maybe flesh that out. I know it's a topic for a whole very long
Oh,
podcast.
we could talk all day about
But
this one.
maybe,
Yeah,
yeah, but maybe
I'm
just
deliberately
like,
holding back, Carl.
I know, but like in relation to what we're talking about, maybe just, I don't know. I just feel like I want to honor people's, it's like the human mind has always got these little, hang on a minute, what did you say there? So let's just maybe try and answer that a little bit. I mean, it's an impossible question to ask in a short sentence, but what would you say?
To which part? Sorry, Carl.
Just purely about Bitcoin standard. If we're, I just want to thread it in with like we
I
start
see.
with, okay, so you've got Bitcoin mining.
Mm-hmm.
It's able to, take advantage of wasted energy effectively.
Mm-hmm.
That then leads to efficiency as opposed to inefficiency. That then can impact on a national level, on an infrastructure level. Um, and then we came to this point about, okay, in terms of the work that all of this is doing, there is a lack of any work in that global network, the most, secure and one of, let's call it one of the most innovative networks that's ever been created in mankind. Certainly has a financial application. Now we're talking about how it has potentially an impact on energy as well for nation states. So, and then we talked about, okay, so there are different countries who are providing mining, and therefore some of them are putting more into that energy infrastructure in terms of the actual work, which means it's more Bitcoin that's mined, but also maybe
Or,
just,
or rather, they're adapting their energy infrastructure. They're using the resource that they have.
yeah, good point. I mean, that's an interesting word, isn't it? Adapting, because I think this is, I mean, it's also the second thing I was coming to as well is like, I mean, we've touched a bit before about, okay, so you've got the way things, I think human minds always like to think about, this is how things are done now, and this is how it could be. And I think that's really what we're talking about today. It's like
Mm, mm.
there's these new opportunities to do things differently, to bring more efficiency. And it touches on a few elements. So we've got this mining, we've got this network, which is secure. And then we've got a whole load of other countries who are already plugged into that network, are
Mm-hmm.
therefore benefiting from it in terms of producing Bitcoin in those areas. But just maybe tie in, if we kind of say, okay, let's not go into a big debate about the Bitcoin standard, but if we take it on that trajectory, there are increasingly, obviously institutions and governments who are thinking, well, let's take just a little bit on the government level. We know there are sovereign wealth funds who are, thinking about strategic reserves of, what they might perceive as a commodity such as Bitcoin. The US have said they're going to sit on it and not sell it. There's Bhutan who've been actually producing the stuff. I think they took a bit off the table, but there's certainly, I
Mm-hmm.
think
They did.
there's a long-term thing. We've got countries like El Salvador, we've got countries like China. So, sometimes I was at an event yesterday where they're talking about we're going into a multipolar world where we've got no longer the US empire telling everybody what to do. To map it to your oil analogy, you've got powers like China, Russia, and a lot of other areas geographically who are all thinking, well, we're not post World War II anymore. We're kind of quite powerful in our own right. We're doing our own alliances and, doing deals, where the BRICS have come together where you've got these infrastructures as a group, and then you've got the UK, and where is the UK, who have we got friends with? What kind of collectives are we in? Well, are the EU our friends? Are the US even our friends anymore? And with this little island, with a bit of oil, like you said earlier with that analogy. But I'm also conscious. I'm one of the groups that I'm curious to think about that might ever watch this video are the the politicians who are setting policy. I almost want to kind of have them in mind a little bit. Maybe I'm not asking a very clear question yet because I'm just sort of laying out a few things there to then plug in your narrative. But if Bitcoin, I think as a standard for store, people often talk about storing energy and storing this kind of financial network that has been birthed where people feel like they do some work and then they want to maybe store some value because they want to protect themselves against inflation, whether it's an individual or company or government. um, and therefore there is this adoption that's happening. Where do you want to I haven't asked a very good question now. I'm a coach. I'm supposed to be good at asking questions. Just say
Well,
something
I
to
mean,
back up
look,
what I've just said. Come on, you
yeah,
know.
I mean, I think it's you were asking about, heading towards kind of any form of global Bitcoin standard fundamentally. And yes, you're right. We are thinking long term. But the point I would make is you think about where Bitcoin was even before you and I were involved. So what's that, 17 years ago, something like that. It was just some simple, crazy idea. Then it was kind of a geeky, weird thing, and then people started speculating on it, then people started spending it and using it and storing it, and now it's suddenly that last year or the year before, whenever it was, ETFs suddenly came about. There's this kind of institutional adoption which is developing all the time. There's better regulation. The trajectory is clear. So, no one can deny this thing is here to stay. Of course it's here to stay. It's now a question of how big will this thing get. Our view, my view, probably your view as well, is that almost certainly it's just going to keep growing and being adopted, and it will move into all different aspects of our lives. Now, why is that important in the context of what we're talking about here, I guess, is part of the question. And that's because the network, as it becomes more valuable, what is it now, 1.5 trillion, something like that. So, as it moves into, 5, 10, 20 trillion in the years to come, the value of that network and the value of that hash rate becomes more and more important. And there is a stage, I believe, where it gets to where countries will say, well, this is now part of our infrastructure, it's part of our energy infrastructure, it's part of our financial infrastructure, because this feeds our sovereign fund. And if you suddenly find that you are not you're not contributing to the hash rate, you're not producing any Bitcoin at home, that means you need to rely on other countries to sell it to you, like importing oil or something like that. So that's probably the simplest way of looking at that. And I accept this is longer term, but it's something that needs to be thought about now, in my view.
Yeah, no, wonderful. And I think it's like you say, there's those two sides of it. It's like it's not doing it because of some philosophy. It's doing it because of a potential gain in efficiency. And then, everything else you said as well. So interesting stuff. One of the things we know about Bitcoin, I mean, you used the word protocol earlier. I mean, we're talking about infrastructures. Just touch on the aspect because I know we've kind of hinted at it, but I'm very curious because I do feel like what you're talking about today is, you know, we can think big and it could solve some really big problems. There's the topic of energy, there's the topic of the grid. And I think sometimes, people in when they understand Bitcoin, they understand this thing which you've touched on a little bit about how it has its decentralized architecture and how important that is to the Bitcoin network in terms of
Mm.
security and actually how it's been adopted globally. And it's the first really tool of its kind that mankind seems to have created where there is this decentralized scarcity and it functions in. I'm curious about whether we can map that a little bit into the efficiency topic, which I think is, one of
Mm.
the headlines of today's discussion. Just talk about, with all the knowledge you have about the national infrastructure, the way the grid works. Is it centralized? And is this about a decentralized
Yeah.
version of a power infrastructure? Just explain that to people.
You're exactly right. In fact, all grids have really faced the same problem over the last few years. Because if you think about it, if you go back, I don't know, 30, 40 years, whatever it is, you had the grid was built to manage several centralized large power sources. So whether that was nuclear or coal or whatever it was, they were stable. They were might even have been government owned. They were managed, and that would feed into a grid, and that grid would just balance that power according to the demands rather than supply side, because that could be controlled relatively easily. Now, fast forward to today, and if you've even got solar panels on your roof, you can contribute to the grid at micro level, but you'll be sending power to the grid when you have excess. Now, imagine there's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of these just on that level. How do you manage that? Okay, so that is a problem for a grid. The other thing is we have moved into all of these smaller producers. So there are these small hydro units, AD plants, private wind farms. These exist, just a couple of wind farms, a couple of small units. So now you've got variable power everywhere, totally decentralized, because these elements, a lot of them are privately owned, but feeding into what is effectively a national grid. So the power distribution system itself is still centralized, you could argue, but the inputs are totally decentralized. And of course, the same thing applies as Bitcoin in many ways. You don't have to turn your wind farm on. You can keep it off for whatever reason or another. You don't have to turn your CHP on or run your hydro. They're all the same thing. The grid's still got to adapt to that, but you have that element of control. And there is a kind of lovely synergy between that and Bitcoin mining itself, because you and I could just go and plug in a Bitcoin miner now at home, be loud and noisy and hot, but we can do that and contribute immediately to the kind of network that is Bitcoin. And so power can be thought of in the same way. And all we're doing is literally taking that decentralization and using the decentralization of power to match those two things together in many cases. The only exception to that, of course, being the demand for constraints market that we talked about, which is run through NESO, our energy operator. But everything else is, project by project decentralized system. So yeah, there's a lovely synergy there.
And just, I think we didn't touch on it. It's one of the things that maybe some people who are kind of getting curious and hearing about Bitcoin mining for the first or early stages, the adaptability of it. You used that word. It was obviously, again, when we're talking about efficiency, just talk a little bit about, obviously, there's one of the common things that people talk about with Bitcoin mining is the fact that it can be switched on and off at whatever time makes sense for the grid and so on.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ways that we can contribute, because there's the binary part of this, which is just turning it on or off, right? So that means you can participate in something, markets like the balancing mechanism. So that's when there's too much power in the grid, and effectively the grid says, look, we need this power to go somewhere. Can you power up? So we'll say, yeah, we can switch on our miners and say, well, thank you very much. We'll compensate you a little bit for that, because it's got us out of the hole. I mean, I'm saying this in a very kind of colloquial way, but it's essentially how that works. Now, conversely, if we're operating, and let's say we've got 1 megawatt running somewhere on a certain point on the grid, and they realize, okay, we've got a problem coming up, we haven't got enough power, can you turn off? And we'll pay you to turn off. And we'll say, yep, sure, we'll turn off. So we won't be using that power. You can use that power elsewhere then. So this is all part of how the balancing mechanism works, and lots of other aspects of that. But there is an even cooler part of this, and that is that there is something in between the binary part of this. This is how flexible mining really is. This takes a little bit more work, but let's go back to one of the projects we talked about, an AD plant or one of the hydro plants. The power that comes out, let's say you've got 500 kilowatt CHP, for example. They can export, say, 300. They might use 100 on site, but they're not going to be using 100 exactly all the time. Someone turns a bit of heavy machinery on, they're going to add a few more kilowatts, turn it off, it will take it off. But the machine will keep producing 500 kilowatts. So it's got to be managed somewhere. And the way that these are managed varies by place. Now, our mining solutions can be set up in such a way that as that power changes, so the power level starts to go up, the mining's hash rate can also start to increase. So it can match the two, so we can load match and power up or power down. So there's a few limitations, but not that many in a practical sense. But that means, you could also provide an additional service to those operators and say, right, you don't have to worry about your local grid balancing now. This can take care of it for you as well. So the flexibility is not just, where you're located or how you get that power or, internet connection or anything like that. It's actually in the operation itself as well. So from binary to variable. It's really cool.
Mm. Just tell me as to kind of get towards the end of this, like the challenges ahead for you. I've been thinking as you've been talking today about, politicians and, different people out there who might, think this, this actually sounds really interesting. Again, I've maybe got two questions here. One, but, who are those people that you feel you want to engage with, and, what are the challenges, or how could people out there help, realize some of these benefits you've been talking about?
Well, I mean, the priority for us right now is investment. We are in a raise round right now, so we are open now in accepting investments to what is really an advanced seed round. So that's kind of primary, because you've got to remember we have spent the last 2.5, probably even coming up to 3 years now, deeply embroiled in this, working out how we can bring all these components together, because it's not just about the money. You've got to know where to go. You've got to find this power. Then when you're dealing with grid and energy trading, you've got to know how to trade the energy, where those trading desks are. So there's quite a lot of complexity, and it was that part that took us a very long time to figure out and put all the components together. So that's it in terms of the company itself. The other part, if people, generally are interested in this, but certainly follow us and, just stay in touch and send us anything interesting that you discover locally about your energy producers, because people do. We actually have clients that someone said, oh, my mate's got a farm and he's got this and doesn't know what to do with it. Can you help him? And it's like, yeah, of course we can. We'll go and have a look. So a lot of this is just about awareness. Spread the word. There is a solution. It can be done. If you have excess power, stranded power of any nature, we can normally help with that. The other part of this, of course, is decarbonisation, because we do have clients who are looking to move away from gas to electrified heat. It's quite expensive to do that in the UK. It's another big problem for us. But if we put a data centre in and have a heat contract, we have a couple of those in progress now, then there is another solution there. But that, again, that came from a very roundabout sort of way. It was a conversation from a conversation from a conversation. So, Bitcoin is pretty clued up guys. In particular, I know there's other parts of this audience, but Bitcoiners tend to follow this stuff quite a bit. And there is now somewhere you can go and get in touch at any time, talk about any subject around this, at any point around this subject.
Yeah, and your details I'll post in the description below, but I mean the website is probably a good place. Where else do you want to get people to maybe find you? I mean, I guess LinkedIn, any preferences?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, most of our updates, obviously the website gives you the overview. There's also the investment details there if you want to take a look at that, and the full pitch deck. But in terms of our front-facing socials, it's normally Twitter, so it's just at Renewablox. And of course, on LinkedIn, you can find myself, my colleagues, Callum Wheeler, Tom French on LinkedIn as well. And of course, there's the Renewablox page. So yeah, by all means, we follow all of this stuff. We do like our Twitter, it has to be said. So you can always DM us at any time. We'll always get back to you.
Yeah, brilliant. And I should just say, obviously I'm not regulated to provide financial advice or endorsements. So if anybody out there is interested in finding out more, particularly on the fundraising side, obviously recommend they take the right kind of proper professional financial advice and all that good stuff. I think we've covered a lot there, and I'm very pumped about the fact that I think, this idea of, I'm always fascinated by startup founders who've got something, that really matters and has real potential we all like a good disruptive story, but the disruption that we really understand is for the good, right? And so thank you for covering so much with me. I hope people have got excited about what could happen bringing Bitcoin mining to Britain, and I'm sure we'll see each other very soon and keep the dialogue going in all the various formats that we have with all of you out there as well. So thanks for your time, Jason, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. It's been a pleasure to be here. And this is one of those where we could go off in any direction and be there for several hours, right? So I think we
The
managed to
beginning
do
of a
quite well
story.
to do it in about 45 minutes. But yeah, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And of course, I'll see you, I'm sure, at future events. Take care.
All the best, mate. Cheers.